Hey everybody, welcome to another virtual Crosswalk worship experience. I'm Pete, I'm the pastor at Crosswalk, and I welcome you to this experience. Quick question before we get into a song and teaching and communion. Heads up on that, we're going to need you to get bread and cup of some sort. I don't really care what, but we're going to be doing that later in the service, so make sure you're prepared for that after the teaching, so you've got a while on that, but we will do that. But before we get into this, just to help you orient yourself for this moment, this time that we're going to spend together, why are you here? Why are you here? Now, it may be that you just have a very everyday, regular kind of reason, like, well, this is what I do on Sunday, and it's part of your rhythm, your life rhythm. That's great. I think that's a really good rhythm to have. I think that's part of this whole thing. I think it's one ingredient of the secret sauce that makes practicing your faith a good value add for your life and makes it work. When we practice it, it actually has its effect on us. But I'm wondering, is there any deeper thing that might be on your mind today? Any greater cause that might be compelling you to pay maybe a little more attention today? A motive that might make you or invite you to lean in a little more deeply, a little further today. So I'm thinking about this for myself. I'm thinking about Psalm 37. It's one of my favorite Psalms. The first few lines of it anyway have been meaningful to me at many parts in my life. This is what it says. This is the New Living Translation. It says, "Don't worry about the wicked or envy those who do wrong. For like grass, they soon will fade away. Like spring flowers, they soon wither. Trust in the Lord and do good. Then you will live safely in the land and prosper. Take delight in the Lord, and He will give you your heart's desires. Commit everything you do to the Lord. Trust Him, and He will help you. He will make your innocence radiate like the dawn, and the justice of your cause will shine like the noonday sun. Be still in the presence of the Lord, and wait patiently for Him to act." Now, forgive the masculine language. That's just how they wrote things and thought back in the day. You'll find out in the teaching that actually the first statement about the presence of God in the Bible is actually feminine, which is great. By the way, to all you women out there, happy Women's History Month. We're going to be looking at female characters throughout this month because they've got something to say for us, and I'll talk more about that in just a bit. So I hope you're looking for that deeper current today, that wellness, that stillness, that connectedness to God that helps us get through, especially times like this. So may the song that comes up take you into that kind of a centered space so that you might be more ready for what the Spirit of God has to say and do to you and with you and through you today. We'll see you at the teaching.
Try to make this kind and clear, just a chance that maybe we'll find better days. 'Cause I don't need boxes wrapped in string and desire and love and empty things, just a chance that maybe we'll find better days. So take these words and sing out loud, 'cause everyone is forgiven now. 'Cause tonight's the night the world begins again. 'Cause tonight's the night the world begins again. And it's someplace simple where we could live, and something only you can give, and that's faith and trust and peace. child that saved this world, and there's 10 million more who probably could if we all just stopped and said a prayer for them. So take these words and sing out loud, 'cause everyone is forgiven now. 'Cause tonight's the night the world begins again. 'Cause tonight's the night the world begins again. I wish everyone was loved tonight and somehow stop this endless fight. Just a chance that maybe we'll find better days. So take these words and sing out loud, 'cause everyone is forgiven now. 'Cause tonight's the night the world begins again. 'Cause tonight's the night the world begins again.
So today I kick off a new series called Spring Cleaning. We're going to spend 4 weeks on this topic. I do not anticipate giving you cleaning tips for your house. This isn't really about that. I'm playing with words here just a bit. And the question I have for you today as we jump into this thing has to do with the word loss. Loss. What comes to mind for you when you think of the word loss? I think for a lot of people, when we hear that word loss, we think about loved ones that we have lost through death. This year in America, over 500,000 people have died directly from COVID-19. 500,000 people and counting. And we have a light at the end of the tunnel, and thank God for that, but that's a lot of loss. Some people, when they hear the word loss, they think about another form, which is a different kind of death. It's a death of a relationship. And maybe that is through divorce or just a harsh breakup, or maybe a friendship went south. We saw that happen a lot over this past year. Combination of different reactions and responses to the pandemic and all the things that were said about that in terms of what we should and shouldn't do, and what should we be restricted from, and what should we make sure we do right, and all that stuff caused a lot of rifts. And then add a political election season to that, and we know that there's been lots of studies done and lots of reporting that friendships and even family relationships have been utterly destroyed this past year because of the stress, and that is significant loss. I'm wondering what loss you have experienced this year. Some of you, of course, it's been devastating, but I have a hunch that if we spend some time on it, we will recognize that all of us have dealt with a serious amount of loss in the last 12 months. And some of the losses that we've experienced may not seem that significant, especially if we qualify loss in terms of death, which isn't really fair. Because if that's the only kind of loss or broken relationship, if those are the only kind of things that we count as loss, then I think we're probably going to miss a lot of losses that we actually go through. My friend Jim Warnock, who was chaplain at the Queen of the Valley Hospital for many years, and a friend and a colleague, he shared this quote with me. He said, "In every change, there is loss. In every loss, there is grief. In every grief, there is grieving. It is unavoidable. It is necessary. It is how God made us, and it is good." I want to talk about loss and grief for the next few weeks. And that may seem like a terrible thing to do for you, but I think we really need it. Because I think if we want spring to be all that it can be, if we want Easter to shine in all of its resurrection glory, if we really want that newness of life, we need to deal with the stuff that is leading up to that. There's a truth that you can't have resurrection without death. And I want to suggest that until we deal with our loss and our grief, we will stunt that new life significantly. So that's what we're going to do for the next few weeks. We're going to be thinking about loss. We're going to look at some biblical examples of loss, and we're going to feature women all the way through because there are some amazing stories about women. I want to talk about that in just a moment. We'll get there. I'm also going to lean into and on my friend Jim because he has led people as a chaplain through grief counseling, grief workshops. He knows this stuff like nobody's business, and his style is just so accessible. And had a great interview with him, and I'm going to be lifting stuff out to share with you throughout these weeks, all with the hopes of us marching toward greater healing as we recognize the losses that we've been through, as we grieve together through some fairly predictable themes that seems to be there for everybody as they go through this stuff, and hopefully come out a little more healed on the other end. It's not, believe me, it's not going to be one of these things like, okay, in 4 short weeks, your grieving's going to be over. That's not how it works. But perhaps we can learn some things about the process that can make our now a little bit more meaningful and powerful, make our Easter stronger, and give us some tools for the losses that we will go through ahead, because we will. So buckle up and let's get into this stuff. I mentioned just a second ago that we're going to be looking at a lot of feminine characters, partly as a nod to Women's History Month, which is what we're in March, and partly because some of these stories that are in the Bible, which definitely include women, are marvelous, and women are at the core of these key stories that I want to look at today. And I just want you to think about this for a moment, of how incredible that is, that this Bible that we have, the stories of the earliest parts of the Bible were probably, being discussed maybe as early as 1500 before the Common Era. And the last pen stroke of what we have in the Christian Bible, the last letters of the New Testament, the ink was drying somewhere around 95 Common Era. That's a large expanse of time, but it also is very ancient. This is long ago. And all of this happened at a time when women were treated as property, as cattle, as sheep, and didn't have many more rights than the cattle or the sheep. And so just let that sink in, that key characters in the story, both Judaism and emerging Christianity, which emerged out of Judaism, both of these feature women as critical characters in the narrative, and elevated them as well in both situations, both in Christian and in Judaism. And so I want you to think about that and just celebrate that, and we rejoice in that. In fact, the very first note, the very first mention of God in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, uses feminine language, which is just so awesome. So we remember from Genesis 1 that at the end of this great creation story, it's a creation poem. We're not supposed to take it literally. It's supposed to look at it just as it is. They took their best shot at understanding how creation came to be, and they did a pretty good job. They recognized there was some order in this thing, and the Jewish theology had this idea that God was very good, and so you see God being good and really enjoying creation all the way through, which was pretty unique really in its day. And then it gets to humanity, and it talks about God creating humanity in our image, using a plurality kind of language for God. But the very first note about God is the word for spirit. And the word for spirit is a feminine word in the Hebrew, which is awesome, and in the Greek for that matter. So that's a pretty cool thing that we have here. But of course, the perhaps better known first female character in the Bible that we have is, as you would have guessed, Eve, of Adam and Eve. I want to talk a little about her story and her life. Most of us remember the story. This is, by the way, just another little Bible nerd moment for you, but when in the second creation story, which happens after Genesis chapter 1, so chapter 2 and 3 and following for a little while, you have the second, more primitive creation story. So it's not quite as poetic. It reads more like a story. In this one, you have God creating the heavens and the earth, creates all the animals, creates Adam. Adam's going around naming everything. And then we get to this line where for Adam, no suitable helper was found. So God puts Adam in a deep sleep, takes out a rib, and creates woman from Adam. So they're of the same stuff. That's what it's supposed to look like. That's what we're supposed to get out of this. They're of the same substance. And then says that this is a woman that will be your helper. That's how she is framed to Adam. Unfortunately, men have been doing the interpretation of the Bible for a long time, and when they saw that word helper, they just kind of thought about it as a servant, and have kept it that way for a very long time. And that's a terrible, terrible interpretation. If you go back and you read what that's really saying, it's using a language for Eve, this woman, the same kind of language that is used for the Spirit of God. The helper, the support, is not less than. It's just a different part. And just as in our understanding of the plurality of God, this in our imageness, that there's no one aspect of God that is greater than another, that's how it was meant to be for Adam and Eve. Not one over the other. We've messed that up. And we're still paying the price for that today. And we have a long way to go. But we've come a long way. But we still have a long way to go on that. So you're familiar with that story. And of course you're familiar with the story of, quote unquote, the way the Christians tell it, is the fall of humankind. And you know how this story is. You've got the Garden of Eden. You have Adam and Eve. You have forbidden fruit. You have the tempter serpent that comes in and tempts them, take a bite of the fruit. They take the bite of the fruit, Eve and Adam, and then all hell breaks loose, and now they're hidden from each other and trying to hide from God. And then they get banished from the Garden of Eden. Now, the way the Christian orthodoxy teaches this is that this sets up this grand narrative which is going to be redeemed by none other than Jesus himself. And the way that it's framed is simply this, that this is the entrance of sin into the world, that everything was great in the Garden of Eden. It was a sin-free environment. Adam and Eve were sin-free. They were in the full presence of God, who must be in a sin-free kind of container, because that's the nature of God. And then when Adam and Eve took the bait, and we kind of look at the serpent as a devilish type figure, which isn't fair. I'll get to that in a minute. But anyway, then we see the entrance of sin, and what happens? They get kicked out as a consequence. They're banished from the Garden of Eden forevermore. It's the fall of humanity, and now they're scrambling, how are we going to get back into favor with God? And so that leads to all kinds of things, all kinds of sacrifices. Jesus ends up answering that question, many, 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 many moons later as becoming the final sacrifice so that we know we can have peace with God. And the way we tie that together is because the Apostle Paul, in a letter trying to incorporate some inclusion issues, by the way, to the Roman church, he is the guy who says, oh, we should probably think about this from a Garden of Eden standpoint and see Jesus as sort of a second Adam here. And that's going to sort of correct the whole thing. We're all joined together in the same humanity, and we're saved by the same grace of God that we've witnessed in Jesus. That's a broad stroke, but that's kind of sets up the whole story. That's how most Christians think of their Christianity. As you say yes to Jesus, that gives you forgiveness of sins, which cancels out the original sin that happened at the Garden of Eden from these two characters named Adam and Eve. Just going to need to take a drink after all that. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you see it, the unfortunate side is that is not how Jesus would have interpreted the Garden of Eden story, or any of his Jewish contemporaries, or any of the Jewish rabbis of his day. None of them would have looked at that story that way. The fortunate reality, therefore, is that if you've gotten stuck on that view of Adam and Eve and the garden and the fall and the entrance of sin and original sin and all that stuff, and you just feel like it's a non-starter, I've got very good news for you. There's a better way to read this story, and it has nothing to do with original sin. This story is a story about coming of age. Jewish boys and girls would hear their parents tell this story, which was a part of the Jewish lore. It was part of their culture, their understanding of who they were as a people. And it was for the entire nation. This wasn't just for individual people, but the Jewish people saw themselves as a people reflected in these stories. The book of Genesis is about Israel, not just the individuals of Israel. It's about the whole nation. And so we see that happening right here in the story. But these children who would hear this story and hear it on multiple levels, they would be given a gift, because they would be given a story that was helping them understand the way things would be for them going forward. They would understand through the story of Adam and Eve and the fruit and no longer being in the Garden of Eden anymore. They would hear this framed as, this is life. Boys and girls, there's going to be a day when you grow up and you decide to be a grown-up. And you're going to find out that it's exhilarating, it's exciting, but it's also hard. It's not what you thought it might be. There are some wonderful aspects of it that you're going to fully enjoy, and then there are going to be consequences that you just could not have anticipated. And every time we go through this, every time we decide to adult in this way, we find out that we are facing, in some ways, wonderful gifts, and in some ways, losses. You know, when we think about loss, it's not just bad stuff, it's also good stuff. When we have wonderful transitions in our lives, when we move into adulthood, for instance, we find wonderful things happening, but we find some awful things. When we first learn to walk as human beings, we find this new freedom to hustle around and make our parents chase us. But we also find pain when we run into stuff and when we fall because we're not very good at it yet. When we grow up a little more and we learn to talk, we find out that our words have power. We're able to communicate and say what we want. But we also discover that some of the things that we say don't end well. And we find repercussions for those things. When we can read, all of a sudden a new world is open up to us, which is magnificent. But we also discover a new world which is opening us up to us, which has some pockets of serious ugly in it as well. And that's hard to see. When we grow into adolescence and we start discovering that there are these other people that we're attracted to, we find out the wonder and joy and terror of that. And when we find ourselves moving forward in that whole thing, we find out with our innocence lost that there are beautiful things and there are painful things about being human beings in relationship with each other. It's not just one-sided. When we get married, we say yes to this wonderful commitment, this covenant, to go into the sunset together, we hope. And yet, even as we say yes with full intentions of joy and hope and all that, there is a loss of some things as well, because we're not single anymore. And I don't mean that for all the weird perverted ways. I mean that just for the normal things. Like we're sharing life now together forever. We're not alone anymore. And that means there are some freedoms that we don't have anymore. It's good, but there's loss with it. When we get promoted in our jobs, we may make more money, we may feel better about the title, but there's also loss. When you move into management, you're no longer just an employee. Your relationship changes, responsibilities increase. There's a loss that happens every step of the way. As we get older, I don't know if you've experienced this, but with every stage of life, there are some things that truly get better and better and better. The research has been done and has discovered that people get increasingly happy after their mid-40s. They get increasingly frustrated until their mid-40s, which makes a lot of sense now that I'm past mid-40s. And they say that, the older we get, generally the happier we get, but we also know there's loss associated with that because we don't have the same physical stamina that we once did. Our hair color changes. We're losing the color that we once had. We can fake it a while, but people get onto it, right? All this is to say that there is loss at every stage of life. And this early story that we have in the book of Genesis, that Eve is right there with, is walking through with, who experienced all of these losses, is a tale for us to look at and just say honestly, life is filled with this great journey that's ahead of us, but there's loss. And the losses have consequences. And it's painful. And to help us get our heads around this deal and just start to ask the question, what losses have we endured in the last 12 months? And what has it done to us? I want to start the conversation today by giving you just a snip of a conversation I had with my friend Jim. And just have him talk a little about grief and loss and what are some of those symptoms that tell us that there may be more going on here in us than perhaps we've been aware of. And maybe our first step today is just simply being aware of the losses that we have accumulated over the last 12 months and the grief that comes with that. And maybe today we begin a process of wondering, what are the things we can do to process through that well, so that we can come out the other side of this COVID thing a little more healthy and a little more ready for a healthy life. So let's check out what Jim has to say, and I'll be back with you after that.
So I think just the reality of loss and grief, allowing ourselves to feel, to experience, to allow ourselves to grieve is just so important, because everything, in society and our friends and loved ones and what we want ourselves is wanting to experience it as little of the grief as possible and get back on with life, and I think one of the most important things about grief is to allow ourselves to grieve and to allow each other to grieve. It's hard because nobody wants to,
Why do you think that is? Is it just the pain thing, or why are people reluctant to sit with this?
Pain, it hurts. It hurts, and the more we kind of allow ourselves to open up to grief, it's like it's frightening too, because there's like a chasm there, that we're afraid of, and I'm afraid to allow myself to just break down, because what would happen, you know? Allowed to Afraid to allow myself to express the anger and some of the negative emotions. Sadness is, you expect that. Okay, here's that. But the anger and the guilt and the what ifs and and then like all the like the confusion kind of stuff that goes on, and the physical symptoms and all those. It's scary, and I don't want to go there. I don't. And I don't want you to, because then what do I do? I mean, if you're really falling apart, that is, on one level, it's just uncomfortable to be around anybody that's miserable, and on a deeper level, it's terribly frightening and distressing. And you can't fix it, and we want to fix it, because everything that's broke's got to be fixable. That's kind of our, and you can't. You gotta write it out, and if you're lucky, if you're blessed, you've got someone who can write it out with you. But one of the most painful parts about grief is that people are just uncomfortable being around it, and so they're uncomfortable being around you, and so. I think I need to fill my gas tank, or something else, and people kind of disappear. And it's and so I can kind of ramble on
No.
about that, but it's just so people. I think we just all try to minimize it, and then we got loved ones who are wanting us to get over it, to giving us kind of platitudes of, well, he's in a better place now, and really bad.
Yeah.
Just like at any time in our life that there's a change, we're losing. Like when you move to a new town, I've lost, my plumber, my favorite grocery store, my mechanic, where the heck Second Avenue is, I've lost all that stuff, and I'm disoriented and got to find all that new stuff, and so it's a loss and a grief, a time of kind of disorganization and sadness, and I miss my old neighborhood and my old friends, and across the street, and so in any kind of change that we have in life, there's a loss involved, and most acutely that's in death, but that happens when we move, when we change jobs. When I retired, was a huge loss for me.
Yeah.
I lost all my close friends. I lost being on call. That was okay. But I lost the meaningful work that I was doing day in and day out, and a daily schedule, and there's just a lot of losses that happen whenever we have a major change in our life. And when there's like a divorce, that's a huge loss, to us. And, again, most acutely when we lose someone in death. But in this COVID time, we have lost our daily expectations of freedom. We've lost our sense of safety. I could just go to the grocery store. Well, do I need to go today? And okay, let me get my gloves and my mask. And what's Dr. Fauci recommending now? That he didn't recommend 2 weeks ago. We've lost our, having Tom over, across the street, and I haven't hugged my kids in probably 14 months. I haven't hugged my kids. I've seen them by Zoom and stuff, but I haven't touched them. And now that I got my second vaccine, which that was just a total gift, being a volunteer at the Queen that I got to do. But I was finally able to hold my grandbaby in my arms just the other day, and it's like that was just, you know, to have the people that we love, you know, wanting to stay away from us and us wanting to stay away from them. Horrible. And you know, not being able to go to church, you know, and having to move, you know, learn this, if we are willing to or able to, this Zoom thing. At least we can see each other, but we can't touch, you know, and we can share Holy Communion. Some denominations let you do that at home, you know, our part of the Lutheran Church does, which I'm grateful for, and it's a way of being in communion, you know, but, you know, and all those fellowship groups and, you know, sitting over the, you know, the fellowship hall over the table and, you know, seeing our friends, we've had so many losses, you know, and I haven't lost anybody that I know personally to COVID, you know, but it's profoundly impacted my life, you know, and it's frightening and it's just disillusioning and it's isolating and it's sad when I, you know, like you're watching the news and they're difficult but important. Kind of at the end of the news broadcast, they give you a profile of some people who have died that week. You know, and that's, you know, it brings up the sadness and the reality of it, you know, and, you know, and the anger about it, you know, and how it was so mishandled and I'm just so angry about it, and it just didn't have to be like this, and all of that stuff is loss and grief.
You know, one of the huge gifts of the Garden of Eden story for Jewish children was not just that we're going to have our moments in life where things don't go great, that there are going to be many nests that we choose to leave, that we, and sometimes don't choose, just get kicked out of them as well. And those are going to be painful things where there's loss involved. But there's also a very good news side to this story. And again, we need to do a little corrective here because this isn't always recognized in the Christian tradition. A lot of times in the Christian tradition, when Adam and Eve get kicked out, we kind of see God as kind of get a jerk going on here, where he's like, "You're never coming back, and I'm gonna put some sentries outside so you can never come back to see me." I mean, it's just a weird story, and this doesn't make God look great, by the way. I don't know if you've noticed that, but this, I mean, if my dad, you know, or my parents said, "We never want you home again, and we're gonna hire security to make sure you can never return," I don't know that I'd want to return at that point. You know what I mean? And that's kind of how it's framed sometimes in the story. And we forget a very good news piece here, which was not lost on the Jewish audience. I think it's still not lost on the Jewish audience because that's the original audience. And I think their rendering of the story is the one we need to go with because it's a Jewish story. And the story here that we see is, yes, Adam and Eve decide to adult a little bit, and it comes back to bite them. They find out they're out of the nest, and now they got to figure out how to make it on their own. But you know what we find out in the story? We find out that God was with Adam and Eve while they were in the Garden of Eden, taking care of them. But you know what happens right after they get kicked out? God is still with them. God has not abandoned them. And you know what God is doing with them? God's still looking after them. God's still taking care of them. He knows they don't know how to make clothes. There's no Old Navy nearby. So what does God do? God makes them clothing so that they're not naked anymore. Not to cover up the shame of nakedness, but to protect them from the elements. Because God wants to protect those that he loves. What else do we see here? God is also painting a picture for what the future is going to look like. A lot of times we look at this as this terrible curse. We need to see this differently. This is God saying to Adam and Eve, hey, I want you to know what the lay of the land is going to look like going forward. And remember, this is Jewish lore. This is a story. And so don't read this like a newspaper article. Because what we see here, God is saying is, okay, Adam, you're going to be working the land. It's going to be tough for you guys to make it, but you're going to make it. You can do this. It's going to be sweaty. It's going to be stinky. It's going to be hard labor sometimes. But the point is, you can make it. Work hard. It's going to work out for you. And to Eve, God is saying, hey, great news. You're going to give birth to children. Side note, it's going to be terrible. But you're still going to be happy about it somehow afterwards. That's a gift. I'm never going to experience that. I'm glad I'm never going to experience that. But isn't it better knowing going forward that that's part of it, and it's going to feel like you're dying, but you're probably not going to die? That's good news. And that's just part of the journey. This is God preparing for them. This is God giving them a vision that I'm going to be with you. I'm helping you right now. I'm giving you a clue about the future. And it's going to be okay, kids. You're going to make it. It's not going to be easy, but you can make it. I made you to flourish. So go do it. This sounds like a good mother to me. This sounds like the Spirit of God and all of her beauty being a wonderful, loving, nourishing presence to her beloved children. This is the mom, who's wanting to make sure her kids are all wrapped up tight so they're not going to freeze in the cold. This is the mom who's going to want to make sure they're fed and want to make sure that they know how they're going to get their next meal. This is mom having a conversation with daughter, saying, I know what you're going to be going through. It's not going to be fun. But I'm going to be with you, and it's going to be okay. This is a beautiful expression of the divine feminine, and it still gives us hope today if we'll have it. My friends, you and I have gone through tremendous loss, unspeakable loss for some of us in the past 12 months. It has been hard. Even the small losses carry with them their grief that we need to recognize and process well. But the good news is that God is with us. God is with us. God is with us, loving us, nourishing us like a loving mother does. I'm going to give you just a minute to sit with this, and then we'll have communion together. So go. Not long before Jesus died, he told his disciples that he was going away to prepare a place for them. And that if he was going to prepare a place for them, it meant that he was going to come back and get them someday, so that they could be with him where he was going. He was talking about an afterlife, that there was something to hope for beyond the grave. This was kind of a new thought for Jewish people back in that day. They didn't think a lot about the afterlife until what we call the intertestamental period. That was the space between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It was a period of about 350 years or so in there. And that's when they started to develop the idea. There was an entire branch of Judaism that did not even recognize any kind of afterlife. It was actually the people in Jesus' neck in the woods, who we call the Pharisees, that really started to believe in this and develop their ideology about this. That's why Easter is such a big deal, as these disciples experienced Jesus, although in different form, in a new way, alive, even though they saw him die. And that was very powerful to them, because they just lost their master, and yet in a different form, different way, they were absolutely convinced that they experienced him again. and that he said to them, I am with you always. I am with you always. As we go through our losses, as we go through the process of grieving our losses that we have been through collectively over the last 12 months, I just want you to remember, and remember with communion, that you are not going through this alone. You have other people. You're welcome to call Crosswalk your people if you don't have any other people, and know that you're not alone, that you've got a community with you. If you don't have a pastor, call me your pastor, and I will pastor you through this stuff. And know that you have a God who has been celebrated as being with us for thousands of years. So when we look at the bread, I think about flesh. This is how the early church thought of it. Jesus understood what it was to experience real, true loss of flesh, of life, of suffering in his own body. And so we share that with him, that he is not a stranger to our infirmities. He's not a stranger to suffering. And there is a certain solace that comes with that. So remember Jesus with the bread, and remember, you are not alone in your suffering. Take and eat. The cup is a remembrance of blood that has been shed for us. Another sign of suffering for sure. Some of the losses have cost us sweat and blood, and sometimes it's very literal. Some of the suffering that we've gone through has hit us to our core in an internal kind of a way, that our very lifeblood has felt like it's been challenged. Well, that was not lost on Jesus either. And throughout his life, he experienced lots of loss because he chose and chose and chose to keep going forward. And with every step forward, it always meant some pushback, some kind of repercussion for him too. That's part of living. It's like that's part of our lifeblood. That's part of what Jesus lived too. And yet, the disciples experienced him as living on in some way. And we'll talk more about that on Easter Sunday. But for today, as you hold up that cup representing this blood of Jesus, remember, you share this with him. You share this human experience with him. You are not alone. He is one that understands all of the workings of both the body, the flesh, and the blood itself. Take and drink. One way of stepping into this processing of our losses and accompanying grief is to actually agree to the Lord's Prayer that we say every week. Agreeing to the Lord's Prayer, joining Jesus in saying the Lord's Prayer, is a saying to God, I want to become more whole. If you look at the whole thing together, it's really what it's after. Is how do we become more rooted and aligned in who God is and who God is in us? How do we become more like the Spirit of God that is with all of us and informing us? That's what this prayer is an invitation toward. It's not a magic formula. However, if you actually live out the tenets of the prayer, I think you'll see some magic happen. Not because it is inherently magical, but because it will lead you into walking in the Spirit of God, which leads toward life and healing and restoration and redemption and all these other wonderful things. Won't you join me now in saying the Lord's Prayer that we know so well? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Have a great week.